There comes a time in life when the question quietly changes. For years, we ask ourselves, what do I still need to accomplish? Then one ordinary morning, without even realizing it, we begin asking something else. What part of myself have I been meaning to come back to? Sometimes, the answer has been waiting for us, for longer than we care to admit. When we're young, we dream about becoming someone, a doctor, a teacher, an engineer, a parent, and somewhere along the way, many of those dreams come true. But life has a gentle way of asking another question. Not, did you become successful? But, did you remember the person you wanted to be before life became so busy? I think that's a harder question, and a more honest one. A man named Walter shared this story with me not long after he retired. He was 63. For 41 years, he worked as an electrician, the kind of man who could walk into a room, listen to a strange buzzing sound, and somehow know exactly where the problem was. He liked fixing things, light switches, old radios, broken lamps, anything that deserved another chance before being thrown away. People respected him. His co-workers trusted him. His family depended on him. If you asked Walter whether he'd had a good life, he wouldn't hesitate. I've been lucky. And he meant it. He loved his wife. He adored his children. He was proud of the work he'd done. He wasn't looking back with regret. Not exactly. There was simply one small dream that had waited very patiently for more than 50 years. The first Monday after retirement, Walter woke up at 5:30, exactly the same time he had for decades. For a few seconds, he lay there listening, waiting for the alarm clock. It never rang. He smiled, reached over anyway, and turned it off, out of habit. His wife laughed from the other side of the bed. "You know you don't have to do that anymore." Walter smiled. "I know. But I guess my hands don't." An hour later, he was sitting alone on the front porch, a warm mug of coffee resting between his hands. The neighborhood was just beginning to wake up. A newspaper landed on a driveway across the street. A woman walked her dog. Somewhere nearby, a garage door slowly rolled open. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Only one thing had changed. For the first time in more than 40 years, Walter had nowhere he needed to be. He took another sip of coffee and quietly admitted something to himself. He had no idea what to do with a Monday morning. That afternoon, he wandered into the spare bedroom, looking for an old toolbox. Instead, he found a cardboard box tucked behind a bookshelf. The tape had become brittle with age. Someone had written keepsakes across the top. He carried it into the living room, set it on the floor, and opened it. Inside were old family photographs, Christmas cards, a few letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Near the bottom, beneath a stack of magazines, lay a thin music book. Its cover was worn. One corner had been folded over years ago. Walter picked it up carefully. The title read, "Beginning Piano Lessons." He smiled before he even opened it. "I haven't seen this in forever." His wife looked over from the couch. "I forgot you still had that." Walter nodded. "So did I." He turned the pages slowly. The paper had yellowed. A few notes were circled in pencil. Someone had written finger numbers above the keys. Suddenly, he wasn't 63 anymore. He was 10. Standing outside the window of Mrs. Peterson's little piano studio, listening to another child practice. Every Tuesday after school, he would stop for a minute, sometimes two, just long enough to hear a melody drift out through the open window. His mother would smile. "You like that music, don't you?" Walter always nodded. One afternoon, he finally gathered the courage to ask, "Do you think I could learn someday?" His mother knelt beside him, smoothed his hair, and smiled with a tenderness he would never forget. "I hope so." Then she added quietly, maybe someday. Walter looked down at the old music book resting in his lap. He whispered the words almost without thinking. Maybe someday. Then he looked around the quiet living room. The coffee on the table had already gone lukewarm. He smiled to himself. What if this is someday? Walter closed the old music book, not because he was finished looking at it, because somewhere deep inside, he'd already decided something. He just wasn't ready to admit it. He placed the book back into the box, carefully, almost exactly where he'd found it. Then carried the box upstairs. Life went on. At least, that's what he told himself. Over the next few weeks, retirement settled into a routine. Coffee on the porch, a walk through the neighborhood, a trip to the hardware store, even when he didn't really need anything, helping his daughter hang shelves, watching baseball on quiet afternoons. By all accounts, it was a good life. But every now and then, he'd catch himself thinking about the little piano book. The thought would appear quietly, usually when the house was still. Maybe someday, the same words he'd carried for more than 50 years. One Saturday morning, Walter and his wife stopped at a small farmer's market. While she wandered between flower stands, Walter noticed something across the street, a handwritten sign in the window of an old brick building. Piano lessons, children and adults welcome. He smiled, then immediately looked away, almost as though someone had caught him doing something embarrassing. His wife followed his gaze. You should go in. Walter laughed. I was just looking. I know. She smiled. But you've been just looking for most of your life. He didn't answer, because she was right. Not only about the piano, about a lot of things. There are dreams we postpone, because life asks us to. And then, there are dreams we keep postponing, simply because postponing becomes a habit. That afternoon, Walter mowed the lawn, changed the batteries in the smoke detector, organized a drawer full of screws and nails that had somehow become mixed together over the years. He stayed busy enough not to think, until evening. When the house grew quiet again, he found himself standing in front of the hallway closet, looking at the box. He smiled. You really aren't going to let this go, he whispered. He wasn't talking to the piano book. He was talking to the 10-year-old boy who had never quite stopped waiting. The following Tuesday, Walter parked outside the little music studio. He stayed in the truck, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching children walk in carrying music folders. Some laughed, some looked nervous. One little boy couldn't have been older than 7. He ran ahead of his mother, nearly tripping over the front step because he was so excited. Walter smiled, then looked down at himself. A 63-year-old retired electrician. What am I doing here? He muttered. For a moment, he reached for the ignition key, ready to drive home. Just then, the front door opened. A young woman stepped outside, carrying a stack of sheet music. She noticed Walter sitting in the truck, walked over, tapped lightly on the passenger side window. Walter rolled it down. Can I help you? She asked with a warm smile. Walter looked almost embarrassed. I think I'm in the wrong place. She glanced at the sign, then back at him. Are you here for lessons? Walter laughed. I think I'm about 40 years too late. The young woman smiled. Not politely, genuinely. She shook her head. I don't think music keeps a track of birthdays. Walter looked at her. She held out her hand. I'm Emma. He shook it. Walter. She nodded toward the front door. Well, Walter. She smiled again. Would you like to come inside? Walter hesitated, just for a second. Then he looked back at his truck. The easy choice was to start the engine, drive home, tell himself he'd tried. Instead, He turned off the keys completely, stepped out into the crisp autumn air, and quietly followed Emma toward the little studio. The room was smaller than he expected. Sunlight spilled across an upright piano near the window. A shelf held children's music books, beside collections of classical pieces. Somewhere, a metronome clicked softly. Steady, patient. Emma pulled out the piano bench, then looked at Walter. Not as though he were too old, not as though he were unusual. Simply, as though he were her next student. She smiled. Then, let's begin. For reasons Walter couldn't explain, those two words made him feel 10 years old again. Walter laughed when he told me about his first lesson. I've fixed electrical systems in buildings bigger than this studio. But those 88 piano keys, they scared me to death. Emma laughed. They do that to a lot of people, especially adults. Children, she explained, don't spend much time worrying about looking foolish. They simply press a key and wonder what the next one sounds like. Adults are different. They spend too much time wondering whether they're already too late. Walter nodded. I guess she was talking about more than piano. The first few lessons weren't easy. His fingers felt stiff. The notes blurred together. His left hand seemed determined to ignore whatever his right hand was doing. Sometimes, he'd stop halfway through a simple exercise and laugh. I used to wire entire office buildings, and now I'm losing an argument with my own thumbs. Emma would smile. That's all right. They're learning. She never hurried him. She never compared him to anyone else. She simply celebrated tiny victories. One correct chord, one smoother transition, one measure played without stopping. Walter began to understand something. Progress rarely arrives all at once. It introduces itself, one small step at a time. Months passed. Every Tuesday afternoon, Walter parked in the same space outside the studio. The receptionist began greeting him by name. The little children waved as they hurried past him into their lessons. One afternoon, a young boy looked up at Walter and whispered to his mother, "Is Grandpa taking piano too?" Walter heard him. He smiled. "So am I." The little boy grinned. "Cool." Then ran inside. Walter laughed all the way to the piano bench. One evening, his granddaughter Emily came over after school. She noticed the piano book lying open on the dining room table. "You play piano now?" Walter smiled. "I'm trying." She looked surprised. "I didn't know grown-ups could start learning new things." Walter laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "I wasn't sure either." Emily thought about that for a moment, then climbed onto the piano bench. "Can you show me what you know?" Walter hesitated, only for a second, then sat beside her. He played a simple melody. Slowly, carefully. He missed one note, then another. Emily didn't seem to notice. When he finished, she clapped enthusiastically. Again. Walter looked at her bright smile and suddenly realized something. At 10 years old, she wasn't judging his mistakes. She was only enjoying the music. Somewhere along the way, adults forget how to do that. Nearly a year after his first lesson, Emma handed Walter a new piece of music. He recognized it immediately. He looked at her. "This one?" She nodded. "I know." It was the same simple melody he had listened to through Mrs. Peterson's open window. When he was 10 years old, Walter placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment, he simply sat there. The room was quiet. Sunlight rested across the piano. The old metronome clicked patiently beside him. He took a slow breath and began to play. The melody wasn't perfect. A few notes came a little late. One chord buzzed softly before he found the right fingers. Emma didn't interrupt. She simply listened. When the final note faded, the room became still again. Walter looked down at his hands, then smiled. Not because he'd played well, because after more than 50 years, the little boy standing outside that music studio had finally made it inside. A few days later, Walter carried the old music book back to the spare bedroom. He placed it in the same keepsake box, then paused. He smiled and took it back out again. His wife laughed from the hallway. "I thought you were putting it away." Walter shook his head. "No, I think this one belongs on the piano now. As I get older, I've stopped believing that starting over has anything to do with age. More often, it has to do with permission. Permission to be a beginner again. Permission to make mistakes. Permission to learn something without needing to be good at it. Maybe that's one of the quiet gifts of growing older. We finally realize there's no audience keeping score, only the promises we once made to a younger version of ourselves. If there's something you've been quietly saying, maybe someday, I hope you remember. Someday was never a date on the calendar. It was always a decision. Thank you for spending this evening with me. I'll see you again next time.